So when we do scholarship in the history of philosophy, we're really engaged as philosophers, which is why I also reject the distinction between doing philosophy and doing history of philosophy, because philosophy is an enterprise in which you are in dialogue with others over theses and arguments. And those of us who do history of philosophy are also in dialogue with others, just that the people we're in dialogue with happen to be long dead. And so we actually have to hold up both sides of the conversation.
All right, so welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Stephen Nadler. He is Vilas Research Professor and the William H. Hay, the second professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His work focuses primarily on 17th century philosophy, like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, and others. And he has a variety of published works in this area. His books include, among many others, Spinoza Life. I think that has a second edition out recently. Think Least of Death, Spinoza and Live and Heretics, The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, The Best of All Possible Worlds, A Story of Philosophers, God and Evil, Descartes, The Renewal of Philosophy, and so on. I can't hope to list them all here. But today we're going to be focusing on his upcoming book, The Good Cartesian, Louis de la Forge and the Rise of Philosophical Paradigm. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Nadler.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus today on your upcoming book, called The Good Cartesian, Louis de la Forge and the Rise of a Philosophical Paradigm. So before getting into some details on this book, could you mind giving a brief overview about this book, like what it's about, who's it for, like who would enjoy reading this?
Yeah, it's about, I think, one of the great undersung heroes of Cartesian philosophy in the 17th century. And by Cartesian philosophy, I mean the philosophy of Descartes as it was expanded and promoted and corrected and elaborated on by his followers in the second half of the 17th century, after Descartes died in 1650. So de La Forge was born in 1632. He died in 1666, so he had a relatively short life and an even shorter philosophical career. We really only have two published works by him. The first is a commentary to Descartes' Treatise on Man that was published in the 1664 edition of that treatise that came out in Paris. And La Forge also supplied illustrations for that edition that was published by Descartes' friend Claude Berthelier. And then a year later, La Forge published his own treatise on the human mind, Traité de l'Esprit, which he proposed as basically a conclusion or continuation of Descartes' project of giving a full philosophical account of the human being, both as a body and a mind, and as a union of mind and body. And Descartes' philosophy at that point was quite embattled, especially in the Netherlands, but also soon to be even more so in France. And so La Forge's defense of Cartesianism, where he both completed some of the things that Descartes had intended, but also, I think, in serious ways modified some of Descartes' ideas and went on to defend Cartesianism against its critics. I think he played a really important role in the subsequent fortunes of Cartesianism, whereby it became the dominant philosophical paradigm second half of the 17th century. The book, I'll confess, is mainly for people who study 17th century philosophy, but that doesn't mean it's only for academics, because I hope to have written it in an accessible enough style so that people who simply are interested in the history of philosophy, who have an interest in seeing what happens to Descartes' philosophy second half of that century. It's both an introduction to La Forge's life and his role as a thinker, but also to some really pressing philosophical problems about causation, about the mind, about the body, and about mind-body relations in that period.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, and I think this is a common circumstance, is that a lot of people, even people trained in philosophy nowadays, you'll have heard of Descartes, probably read some of the Meditations and maybe some other things, know some of the stuff on mind and causation and other things that he's written on, but and his broader metaphysical picture and theism. But like, I don't coming into this, I didn't know much about like the how it arose, how the other sort of figures that were promoting it and arguing it, and how it sort of took hold. So it's kind of interesting to read. I think just getting some of this historical context and the different factors that came into the development and reception, and then the rise of the kind of school of thought that we associate with Cartesianism. So.
Yeah, for a long time, in teaching and in research, the typical approach was to pick these individuals, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, pick them and their texts out of context and look at them as standalone works. Well, over the last 2 decades or so, I think we have a much richer sense of the plurality of philosophizing in the 17th century, the personal relations between these philosophers, and the historical and even political roles that they played in furthering their philosophical camps. So I think we're having a much more historically grounded understanding of philosophy without necessarily ceasing to pay attention to the ideas themselves and the arguments. I mean, I think I do distinguish between doing history of philosophy and doing intellectual history, because when you're doing history of philosophy, you are doing philosophy. You're considering arguments and theses, and you're assessing those arguments. Are they valid? Are they sound? What could the philosopher have said to bolster their position? What should they have said? Or even what would they have said to certain objections that one might rise? So when we do scholarship in the history of philosophy, we're really engaged as philosophers, which is why I also reject the distinction between doing philosophy and doing history of philosophy, because philosophy is an enterprise in which you are in dialogue with others over theses and arguments. And those of us who do history of philosophy are also in dialogue with others, just that the people we're in dialogue with happen to be long dead. And so we actually have to hold up both sides of the conversation.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. And I was going to ask, like, I mean, how important do you think the surrounding figures, like we're going to talk about Louis de Laforge and others, were in, well, the development of and like sort of reception of Cartesian philosophy? Because I mean, sort of easy to imagine that it could have been sort of dismissed and forgotten as a work in its own without some of these figures. I mean, so how important do you feel like these people were?
I think they were crucial. So if by importance we mean what was their lasting legacy, especially for those of us who continue to study philosophy, you might think that these were minor and insignificant figures, because who's heard of Laforge, who's heard of Géraud de Cornouailles? Maybe Malebranche has a better reputation. But if you look at what was actually happening in that period, who was attacking Cartesianism, who was defending it, you cannot really understand the development of philosophy in the period without looking at these boots on the ground, so to speak, the individuals who are actively engaged. And Malebranche himself, who was a very unorthodox Cartesian, was undoubtedly the most important philosopher in the second half of the 17th century. And fortunately, over the past several decades, his star has been on the rise. But I don't think you can understand what happens between Descartes and Leibniz without looking at all these figures that come between them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then one thing that comes up fairly early in the book, which is sort of interesting, kind of historically, is views about the Eucharist and like whether, because there's this long tradition of coming from Aristotle and others that followed him about substance and form and how to understand the metaphysics of the Eucharist.
Although Aristotle himself had nothing to say about the Eucharist. Let's just be clear about that.
Right. Of course, the what they're getting from Aristotle is the general kind of metaphysical picture of like substance and form, and how you could, in principle, support this view about transubstantiation. That you can have something with this, the same accidents, the same sort of detectable features in terms of, I don't know, the taste and composition of bread, say, but still have the substance of the body of Christ or something like that. And so that was an important thing, as I understand it, for this theological view that Catholics primarily had. And well, one potential issue with kind of Descartes entering the picture here is that could he maintain, if he's going to replace some of that that metaphysical picture, could he maintain a view about the Eucharist that's theologically acceptable or something like that? I mean, I don't know. Do you want to talk a bit more about how the Eucharist was relevant here in the development and sort of acceptance of some of Descartes' thought?
Sure. It was crucial in terms of the fortunes of Cartesianism in France at the time, and more generally in Catholic land. Perhaps less so in, let's say, the Dutch Republic, where you had a Calvinist, dominantly Calvinist intellectual culture, which really didn't put much store in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. The problem, as you, I think, described it well, is that with Descartes, once you jettison the whole Aristotelian framework of substance, where you have a substantial form and then these accidental forms, and this is how late medieval scholastic Aristotelianism understood what happens with the Eucharist, so that when the priest blesses the bread and the wine, the substance of the bread and the substance of the wine are either removed or destroyed and replaced by the substance of Jesus Christ's body. But the accidents of the bread and the accidents of the wine remain, which is why, even though what we have now, according to the theology, is the substance of Jesus Christ really present in the Eucharist, it still looks like bread and it still looks and tastes like wine. But because Descartes rejected that whole metaphysics of substance, for him a body is just extension or three-dimensional space. There are no accidents that can be separated from a body. The question was raised, well, how can you possibly account for Eucharistic transubstantiation? Because by that point, the Aristotelian explanation had practically become as much a part of Orthodox dogma as the notion of real presence itself. And so in response to the objections by Arnaud, the fourth set of objections to the Meditations, and in other contexts, including his correspondence, Descartes offered us several different ways of trying to account for what seems to be going on in the Eucharist through his own principles. But the Catholic Church pretty clearly deemed his attempts heretical, and for that reason, among others, his works were placed on the Roman Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books in 1663, with the proviso until corrected. So, and we think that we know that one of the major offending aspects of his philosophy was his inability to account for real presence. And so Cartesians after Descartes, like Dom Robert de Gabay and others, tried to defend Descartes' views on this by tweaking things here and there. So it really, even after Descartes' death and even after his works were placed on the index, it's continued to be an issue for Cartesians seeking to defend their philosophy.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to think about how like these, I don't want to say independent concerns, but, theological concerns can affect reception of, just even people willing to consider someone's philosophical work, whether it can be, it can accommodate these existing commitments. Sort of interesting.
What's acceptable philosophically in this period is not necessarily what's philosophically provable or true, but what's theologically acceptable as well. Which is why you have Spinoza writing in the late 1660s, arguing that philosophy is one thing and theology is another. There's truths we know by reason and things we believe on faith, and they have nothing whatsoever to do with each other.
Okay, so then Laforge comes on the scene. You said he was born in 1732?
1632.
Sorry, 1632. Descartes died in 1650, I think. So he would have been like 18. And Laforge was trained as a doctor initially. How did he come in contact with the work of Descartes?
That's a good question. And as I try to explain in the book, we don't really know. But he was born in and went to school in the town of La Flèche, which was this. We think he himself attended school in La Flèche, which was the same school that Descartes was in. And he may have been introduced to Descartes' philosophy by some of the teachers there. And then he also ended up in the town of Saumur, which is it's all within the same general area of France. And Saumur was home to two religious establishments that were intellectually rich, and we are pretty certain that several of the figures associated with those establishments were fans of Descartes. And so, either through his formal schooling or in the intellectually vibrant atmosphere of Saumur, um, being trained in medicine, he also acquired a very good knowledge of Descartes' text. One of the questions that I wish we had a clear answer to was whether he was ever in Paris and attended some or many of the salons or academies that in Paris in the 650s, 1660s were focused on discussion of Descartes' philosophy. We simply don't know.
Right. And then at some point, he offered or was tasked with producing illustrations for Descartes' treatise on man. So I don't know. Could you talk a bit about that? And then, of course, what came out of that when he sent them back?
So the Treatise on Man is Descartes' account of the human body as if it doesn't have a soul. And the goal is to establish that the human body is essentially a machine. It's just matter in motion. And all of the most basic functions of the human body, respiratory, circulatory, muscular, and so on, can be accounted for simply by the operations of this machine. Of course, things change when you add a soul to it, but that wasn't Descartes' interest in this book. In this book, he wanted to show how he could, through this mechanical philosophy, account for the way in which the body moves, account for the way in which muscles and nerves and blood and the brain all work together. And when the treatise was never published in Descartes' lifetime, and after his death, his literary executor, Claire Cellier, decided he should publish this work given its importance. And I think it's really one of the most important treatises of philosophy because it's pretty much the first real systematic account of the human body in mechanistic terms. So Claire Cellier is preparing to publish it in the late 1650s, but he recognizes that it needs illustration. The various parts of the body and the processes need to be illustrated for the sake of the reader's comprehension. And he had some trouble actually getting illustrators. He had some false leads up in the Netherlands, but at the same time, just coincidentally, he received an inquiry from this man, Louis de La Forge, a physician in Saumur, probably around 1658, 1659, expressing interest. Like somehow La Forge heard that Claire Cellier was on the lookout for illustrations, and he offered to do them because Claire Cellier had actually advertised in an earlier edition of Descartes' letters that he had published that he was in the process of doing the Treatise on Man. So what Claire Cellier ended up with were illustrations from La Forge and also illustrations from a Dutch anatomist, a man named Gerard van Hoetschaven. And Claire Cellier selected illustrations from both of these individuals to include in the 1664 edition of the treatise.
Right. Yeah. Because what was it that a lot of the stuff that Descartes was saying, he was referring to illustrations that were apparently supposed to be there, but that he didn't supply, or for the most part, didn't supply himself.
Yeah, we think that Descartes had done some, but wasn't satisfied with them. We allegedly have one small drawing that he did, but it's definitely a lot easier to see what's going on in what Descartes is describing when you actually have pictures, because he's talking about this little flap here and that valve and these channels running through the body and how they all meet in the brain. And so the illustrations are quite useful.
Right, for sure. And then maybe the really kind of fascinating turn of events here is that not only did La Forge send in these illustrations, but he sent in full commentary on the treatise that was even much, much longer than the treatise itself. So I don't know. What do you want? want to talk about that and how we wrote this big commentary, and actually not a very long time.
Yeah, it's longer than the treatise itself, and it was unsolicited. So, yeah, you asked for pictures. Here's the pictures. Oh, by the way, I have this long treatise. And so Laforge sets himself basically 4 or 5 tasks in this commentary. First of all, he wants to clarify many of the things Descartes says. He thought Descartes was sometimes a little too short. Could have said more to make things clear. He also sometimes corrects Descartes in light of more recent scientific investigations, and especially dissections, which Laforge himself had probably carried out. So in addition to clarifying, he corrects Descartes, and then he expands things, and he takes up questions that he believes Descartes would have taken up had he completed the treatise. And so he goes into issues about exactly how the animal spirits are carried through the channels in the body. And then he also responds to criticisms of Descartes. And he references both contemporary criticisms and also earlier published works of anatomy. So it's a really interesting commentary on the book. It drags a bit. It's long, and it's not the most exciting thing. It's certainly far less interesting philosophically than Laforge's own treatise on the human mind. But it does establish him at the time as a major participant in Cartesian philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's like, why? I mean, maybe this is just speculation that you would have to give, but like, why do you think he was prompted to do this? Like, it wasn't like he was tasked with it at all, right? I mean, to just write this whole commentary on it. You think he was just fascinated with the Cartesian philosophy and wanted to contribute,
Yeah.
or what do you think?
Yeah, I think he was, and he saw this as his opportunity. I don't know if he was out to make a name for himself, but he saw this as an opportunity to contribute to the fortunes of a philosophy that he thought got it all right, or most of it right, needed some updating and correcting. He also saw it, because he was a medical doctor, as something that he could do, that with his familiarity with the workings of the human body.
So yeah, so as you say, he like updates some things and expands on some things, takes it where he thinks Descartes would go, but also he like corrects some things maybe in light of new science or new argument perhaps. And it's interesting because you talk about like Laforge is an example of a good Cartesian, right? And I guess like being a good Cartesian isn't just being someone who, well, accepts and teaches the things of Descartes, but maybe does more, does in the spirit of Descartes, maybe even correcting him and so on. So like, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you want to talk about what it is to be a good Cartesian in this way? Like,
Yeah, so I think there's 2 ways of thinking about it. One, and it depends upon what the figure takes him or herself to be doing. So let's contrast Laforge with, let's say, Malebranche, who was a major Cartesian. So Laforge takes himself to be faithfully, um, be acting in good faith to complete Descartes' project, both as either Descartes himself would have done, or as Descartes himself should have done. So trying to make the whole system work, making it more consistent, and his views on causation and mind-body relations. I think he knows that he's departing from anything Descartes actually said, and maybe actually anything Descartes would have said, but nonetheless, what Descartes should have said. Malebranche, on the other hand, I would not call, he's a good philosopher, but I wouldn't call him a good Cartesian in Laforge's sense, because Malebranche self-consciously departs from anything Descartes would have sanctioned. And I think Malebranche knows that what he's saying is not what Descartes would have said. Maybe because Malebranche is just as committed to St. Augustine's philosophy as he is to Descartes. And so you could say that Malebranche is a good Cartesian because he takes himself to be improving on Descartes' philosophy. Laforge, I don't think, would take it by improving on Descartes' philosophy by departing from it in various ways. I don't think that Laforge takes himself to be improving Descartes' philosophy in the sense of leaving some of it behind so we can make it better, but rather making it better from within the system. And that's why I think he's a much more faithful Descartes than Malebranche or than Cordemois, who also self-consciously departs Descartes in certain ways.
Right, that makes sense. I mean, it's a little bit, could be a little bit tricky thinking about like, well, what really counts is working on it sort of within the system versus like outside of it, and then just like trying to improve on it. Maybe it's not so. Maybe it's more about the sort of methodology or the mentality that the author has, or I don't know how to think about that.
I think it's. I mean, you could look at Laforge's work and say, no, he really departs from Descartes as well. And especially with his occasionalist views of causation. But Laforge would say, well, no, I'm not departing from Descartes. Maybe I'm departing from the text, but I'm working in the spirit of Descartes to show you what a faithful Cartesian should say about these matters. Whereas I don't think Malebranche would say, here's what a faithful Cartesian should say. Malebranche might respond by saying, here's what a faithful philosopher who's starting from Cartesian principles should say, even if it involves going not just into topics that Descartes didn't go into, but also saying things that Descartes would not possibly have countenanced. So there's a self-conscious departure from Descartes in Malebranche, whereas in Laforge, he would say, I'm on Descartes' side, but here's how he could have and perhaps should have approached some of these problems that he never really got around to doing.
Right, but sometimes he is saying things, Laforge is that like Descartes would not have, right? So it's,
Yeah, but as long as he thinks that these are the things that Descartes could have and should have said, and maybe even would have said had he been enlightened to the implications of his philosophy. Whereas I think Malebranche is a more eclectic thinker, bringing Descartes together with Augustine. And it perhaps makes a difference as well that Laforge is a medical doctor, whereas Malebranche was a Catholic priest. And so Malebranche has his eyes on certain theological issues as well.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, so like, yeah, Laforge is definitely. I mean, obviously, he covers more topics in his treatise that we'll talk about in a second. But in this commentary, at least, yeah, primarily he's talking about and contributing to stuff on like human anatomy and stuff there that he would have more of more of a understanding of than say a theologian typically would. Yeah, and then yeah, you've already sort of talked about it a little bit already, but Laforge. Not that long later, not that long after, I mean, produced his own treatise on the human mind. Or I forget what it was in French, Tête de l'esprit d'homme or something. Sure, yeah, yeah. So, and that is again still in the tradition of Descartes, building on his work on mind and the unity of mind and body and causation and a bunch of other things. So, yeah, I mean, do you want to give a sort of brief overview of this treatise and what he achieved in there?
Sure. I actually think he was working on it around the same time he was working on the commentary on the Treatise on Man. And Clerc-Cellier thought it wouldn't be a good idea to publish this together with the commentary on the Treatise on Man. It would become an unwieldy thing. So Laforge took it upon himself to publish it separately, and it appeared the year after the Treatise on Man was published. And if the Treatise on Man is a study of the human body as if it didn't have a soul, if it were just a machine, the Treatise on Man, the Treatise of the Human Mind, the Traité de l'Esprit de l'Homme, is an examination mostly of first of all, of the human mind itself, the soul. It functions as it reasons, as it senses, as it imagines, as it engages in volitions. So considering all these mental functions and mental states on their own, and then considering the mind as it is united to the body. And so this involves looking both at the way in which states of the body, I use the word cause here, even though this is a problematic term, the way in which states of the body cause mental states, for example, in sensation, in visual sensations, in pains and pleasures, and then also the way in which the human mind can cause effects in the body through voluntary motion. The problem is that causation is an opaque process, and this is, I think, one of the great issues in the 17th century is trying to understand what causation is and how it works. And Laforge really was the first Cartesian, maybe the first philosopher. Well, there were precedents for this in medieval Arabic philosophy, but more than anybody else, Laforge introduced this theory called Occasionalism, which is the view that bodies do not causally interact really with other bodies. One body does not efficaciously move another body, nor do bodies efficaciously cause events in the mind, nor does the mind efficaciously cause events in the body. What's going on in all of these cases is that the collision of two bodies is the occasion for God to put one body at rest and to move the other body. The event in my body, let's say I sit on a thumbtack, that's the occasion for God to cause an event of pain in my mind. And my volition to raise my hand is the occasion for God to cause the arm to rise. And now, this sounds like a crazy theory, but it's also, in fact, quite consistent, if not even implied by, a lot of what Descartes has to say about causal relations and about the nature of the body. For example, if you're a Cartesian, a body is just extension. It's just three-dimensional spatiality, which means the only properties of body are divisibility, size, shape, and mobility. But there's nothing active about extension. There's nothing active about space. It can take on motion, but it can't cause or generate or even affect motion. So you need, within Cartesian physics, you need some cause for the dynamic behavior of bodies. Then in the case of mind and body, there's a whole slew of arguments that Laforge uses to demonstrate that the mind cannot move the body. Some of these have to deal with the radical difference between mind and body on the Cartesian dualist schema. If the body is matter and the mind is immaterial, then what kind of causal engagement can you have between something that's material and something that's immaterial? Laforge believed that there was still some activity in nature because the human mind itself is active. So I do think that, at least in Laforge's occasionalism, when something happens in the body, the mind is capable of producing its own response through its own causal powers. So he's not an occasionalist in all domains. This is one of the things I argue for in the book. He is an occasionalist when it comes to body-body relations. God moves bodies, nothing else moves bodies. He is not an occasionalist, though, when it comes to the mind's own causal powers to generate its own mental states. So when I sit on a thumbtack and these motions are communicated from my butt through the nerves to the brain, that's the occasion, not for God to cause a sensation of pain, but for the mind to generate its own sensation. Now, it's an arrangement established by God, but God doesn't actually, on that occasion, come in and poke the mind, so to speak.
Right. Very good. Okay. So a lot of stuff there to get into.
Yeah, I kind of went on to that. Sorry.
No. It's perfect. It's perfect. No, it's great. I mean, so first on, I mean, you brought up just general issues about causation here, and then a lot of people familiar with Descartes will know the story about his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth, and she's like, well, how do you get this sort of causal connection between the mind, this thinking substance, and the body, this extended substance? And I mean, one thing that Descartes noted was that, well, causation is sort of kind of opaque in the body context in the first place. There's maybe nothing more mysterious about it in this case. So while Descartes definitely wasn't, I think you would say, an occasionalist, maybe there's something in this sort of reply that is amenable to that sort of thinking. Maybe some of, I don't know if you want
Yeah, so I don't think Descartes believed it was that opaque, but I think one of Laforge's great contributions to the discussions of causation period is to bring to our attention that, in fact, we don't know any better how one body moves another body than we know how a mind moves a body or a body has an effect on the mind. So the way he puts it is sort of ambiguous. He says, um, understanding mind-body relations is no more difficult than understanding body-body relations. And you might think, well, okay, that means it's all equally easy. No, but what he means is that we really don't understand. They're on a par. That when we see, and this is something that I think Hume will later get out of occasionalist philosophy, when you see two bodies collide and one comes to rest and the other comes to motion, all you see is a constant conjunction. You see one event followed by another event, but you don't see causation. So first of all, then, there's an empirical argument that causal power is not something we actually experience. We only experience a conjunction of events. Then there are a priori or rational arguments against body-body causation. One of them refers to what I was saying earlier about the passivity of extension. There's also the fact that motion is a mode of a body, and modes cannot be transferred from one substance to another. So there's this conceptual issue about trying to understand body-body relations. And so what Laforge reveals or illuminates for his readers is that body-body relations are just as opaque as Cartesianism's critics believe mind-body relations to be. Now, Descartes did not think that everything was so opaque because in response to Elizabeth's concerns, he says, well, we have a conception for understanding these things. Just don't try to understand it, mind-body relations. Just don't try to understand it in terms of the way in which bodies interact. That's the wrong model. That would be a category mistake. And then Pierre Gassendi, who was another philosopher in the period, raised the same problem as Elizabeth. And what Descartes says in response to Gassendi is the only reason that he's having trouble with this is because he thinks that the only reason that Gassendi is having trouble with my view because he, Gassendi, thinks that if two things are radically different in nature, they can't causally interact. And I reject that assumption. Laforge, I think, brings out the real difficulties here. And his fellow Cartesian, who was also writing around the same time, Cordemois, says something very similar, that we really don't have that understanding of causation in the body-body realm any more than we do in the mind-body realm.
Right, okay, fair enough. And then, okay, so for occasionalism, as you said, like only God really has causal power, efficacy. Any sort of thing that appears to be a causal relation in the world is just some conjunction of events where actually on a particular occasion God causes something else to occur in line with certain natural laws or whatever, however he intended those things to play out.
And I should say that's an important element there, that it's not as if God is just doing this willy-nilly, but there are laws that God is carrying out. So that explains the regularity of nature.
Right. Yeah, that's important. And this is different from, how would you contrast this with, say, like Leibniz's pre-established harmony? It's not quite the same, right? Because on pre-established harmony, they can sort of affect themselves or something.
Yeah. So well, there's two ways of responding to that. On the face of it, they're very different because both occasionalists and Leibniz agree that substances do not interact. One thing does not cause effect in another thing. The difference, however, is that Leibniz says that even though substances are not interactive, they are causally active. That is, they generate their own states. Well, then why is it that substances seem to have coordinated states? That when I sit on the thumbtack, I feel pain. That when one body moves in a certain way and collides with another, the other body moves in a certain way, and so on. Well, that's the pre-established harmony. God has so arranged the laws of substances such that each substance produces its sequence and states in a wonderful harmony with other substances. So on the face of it, they're very different. However, some of Leibniz's critics in the 17th century, and even his contemporary critics now, wonder really what's the difference here, because Leibniz also agrees that God is responsible not just for creating substances, but for sustaining them in existence as well. And so from moment to moment, God is sustaining each substance with the state it allegedly has generated within itself. But isn't that to say, some of Leibniz's critics complain, isn't that to say that God really generates the substance and its state at that time? So, it's a good question of whether Leibniz's pre-established harmony ultimately reduces to occasionalism. It also depends upon how you understand occasionalism is supposed to function. Is it that God says once and for all, let things be thus? Or is God actively involved everywhere, all over the place at every time in bringing about these effects?
Right. So is it just like some initial creative act where he just causes everything from eternity, say, or is it sort of a continual creation, sustaining, and so on that he's engaging as it goes on? Yeah.
Or does God just proclaim the laws of nature and then everything has to obey those laws? I think that's a misreading of Malebranche's occasionalism, but it's one that's been adopted by some scholars.
Right. Yeah. And then, as you say, there were definitely some figures that were like thoroughgoing occasionalists, like Malebranche and Portemoy and others. But Laforge, as you say, was kind of like a partial occasionalist. He thought, in terms of body-body interactions, they didn't have any causal efficacy. It was just God causing these things. But in terms of interactions in the mind, so to speak, and like the generation of ideas and experiences and so on, that the mind did have some causal efficacy there. I don't know. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, for Laforge, the mind can generate its own states, whether we're talking about sensory states or volition. So the mind for Laforge is active. And that's another sense in which he's a good Cartesian. The occasionalism comes in mainly with the motion of bodies. So God is responsible for moving bodies when they collide with each other. And because only God can move a body, something Laforge explicitly says, one of his arguments for occasionalism implies that only God can move a body. That means when I will to raise my arm, God has to move the arm because only God can move the body. So he's an occasionalist in the body-body realm, and he's an occasionalist in the mind-to-body realm, but he's not an occasionalist in the body-to-mind realm or in the mental realm itself.
So what would he say about, like, what does he think that's special about God here? Because God has a mind too, right? What is that special about God, his mind, or his creative abilities, such that he does have causal efficacy over the bodily realm, and whereas we don't with our human minds?
Well, the problem for mind-body causation is not, you don't really get the sense that Laforge is worried about dualism. It's not the radical difference between mind and body. So he's not saying that in principle minds cannot move bodies because of the radical difference in nature between things. In fact, he distinguishes between univocal causation and equivocal causation. Univocal causation is where two things, one thing causes an effect in another when they're of the same nature. But equivocal causation is where one thing causes an effect in another, but they're of a different nature. So he doesn't really see a mind-body problem in that sense, what's called the heterogeneity problem, that they're so radically different in nature that they can't causally engage each other. And that's why he has no problem about saying that this infinite mind, God, can act on bodies. But the other trick is that, well, God has a superpower. It's called omnipotence. And so we're not omnipotent. And so just because I will to raise my arm, it doesn't follow that my arm is going to rise.
Right. Yeah, but I guess so. But then just saying that he just has this power from omnipotence is just like, I don't know, just asserting that he has that power that we don't.
You can't argue with omnipotence.
I guess.
But by definition, God is omnipotent. Once you grant that, and then you grant that the meaning of omnipotence means if X is omnipotent and X wills that something happen, then necessarily that thing happens. That's just the meaning of omnipotence. We are not omnipotent. So just because I will something to happen, it doesn't follow that it actually happens. That's just what it means not to be omnipotent. So once you grant that there is an omnipotent being, that being can play this causal role all over the place.
Right. Yeah, but is that not a power that we could have though? Like, I guess the question is like, why don't we have that power? Even if we grant that God, omnipotent as he's supposed to be, does have it. Like,
well, because we are finite created beings. We are creatures, and creatures just by virtue of being created. I know there are certain political figures who think of themselves as omnipotent, but they're not. If you are a finite created being, by definition, you are not omnipotent, because if you are omnipotent, you would be an infinite eternal being. If you are created, you are dependent on something else. And if you are dependent on something else, you are not omnipotent. I'm sorry to tell you.
fair enough. But I guess the thought is, I could imagine someone saying that, okay, we're not omnipotent, but maybe we do sometimes have this power to influence the bodily realm with our mind,
Well, maybe you do, but Laforge has given you an argument about why only God can move a body. So yeah, maybe you do have a power in your mind to move the body, but because of the nature of body and what Laforge has shown about what bodies are and how they move, you cannot ever efficaciously exercise that power upon a body, because only God can move a body. I mean, the argument is something like this. God is required not just to create things, but to sustain them in existence from moment to moment. And if God were to withdraw that cooperation, things would cease to exist. So when God, let's say, creates a ball, God doesn't just create a ball in some abstraction. God creates a ball in a particular place relative to other bodies. Now, the question is, at the next moment, does God sustain or recreate that ball in the same relative place or a different relative place? If God, from moment to moment, sustains that ball in the same relative place relative to other bodies, the ball is at rest. If God recreates or sustains that ball from moment to moment in different places relative to other bodies, that's just what it is for the ball to be in motion. And Laforge concludes that that's all the motion of a body. That's all that the motion of a body is and can be, because the ball is so thoroughly ontologically dependent upon God, not just for its being, but for its modes of being, that there's no room for anything else to enter in here as a causal agent upon the ball.
Right. Yeah. And then I guess you could say that we're not the ones sort of sustaining it and being from moment to moment. So
No, we're not.
We're not the ones with control over its motion or being at rest, if that's all it is to be in motion.
You got a lot of perks when you're the creator, when you're the omnipotent creator.
Sounds like a good gig. All right. And so, so as you've already said, Laforge is, on your view, a kind of partial occasionalist. I mean, there's some potential worries about the coherence of his view as a partial occasionalist, but you think that it can be made sense of, as it can be sort of reconciled within itself. How do these? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are tensions, because this divine conservation applies just as much to the human soul as it does to the human body. And therefore, not only must God create and sustain a body in some relative place or another, when God creates and sustains a soul in existence, which Laforge admits God does, God doesn't create and sustain it in abstraction, but must create it with some thought or another, in some mode. And so, just as in the case of the bodies, God's conservative activity extends not just to the being of the body, but to its states. So one would think that God's conservational activity with respect to the mind also must extend not just to the being of the mind, but to its states. So I'm not really sure about the consistency of Laforge's view. What he could say, and this might help him, is that unlike the body, which is just extension, what God is creating and sustaining in the case of a mind is not just this passive parcel of matter, but an active substance. And that would be probably the good Cartesian response, because minds are active substances for the Cartesians. And so he could draw that distinction between the nature of the substance that God is conserving in the cases.
Oh, okay. So the idea might be something like, well, in the case of him sustaining the material substance, well, all the work is sort of being done by his sustaining. The substance on its own is just kind of inert beyond that. Whereas in the case of mind or the mental substance, perhaps, yes, he's doing this work of sustaining it, but it's not inert beyond that. It's also doing things.
Right. What he's sustaining is a thing that can do things.
Right.
Whereas that's not the case in the case of body.
Right. I mean, I could still see some pushbacks that people could have there, but yeah, it's a way to.
It's a consistent Cartesian view. Whether it's a consistent philosophical view is a different matter.
So I think you mentioned this already early on, but Laforge, he died rather young. I think he was like 34 or something when he died, and so I guess we didn't see everything that he might have contributed. I mean, what more do you think he might have contributed in a Cartesian sort of paradigm? If he lived longer.
So the treatise on the human mind is really a treatise. I mean, a lot of it is about the mind, but really the mind's states as it relates to the body. And Descartes had told us that one of his plans was after, so in the Principles of Philosophy, which is mostly metaphysics and physics, there was going to be a fifth part, which would be about the human soul itself, and then another part about the human soul as united with the body. And so I wonder whether if Laforge had lived, he would have gone deeper into mind-body relation. That is the ways in which the human mind is embedded in the body and reacts to motions of the pineal gland. So, if Descartes was going to write a treatise on the human soul, in a way, that's what Laforge did, even though a lot of it is about mind-body relations. Most of it's about the soul itself. But then Descartes was going to write that sixth part of the Principles about the mind-body relation. So I wonder if that would have been Laforge's next work.
Right. Yeah, you say like Laforge was one of the last, if not like the sort of last kind of champion of this Cartesian view, but the pineal gland, that it's like the sort of interaction point between the mind and the body, so to speak.
Yeah, most later Cartesians really either they keep quiet about it or they reject it explicitly.
Do you find it kind of surprising that Laforge would be like a champion of this view? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. He, having dissected the human brain, he thought he found the pineal gland, and probably thought that Descartes' arguments for that being the seat of the soul made sense. Later rejections of the pineal gland are based both on a priori considerations that it can't possibly do that kind of work, and empirical considerations that Descartes may have gotten the location of it wrong, its structure, its size, so on. Perhaps had Laforge lived another decade or so, or several decades, and read Malebranche's doubts about the role of the pineal gland and those of other Cartesians, perhaps he might have come to reject it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I always found suspicious. Like, if I remember correctly, one of the kind of central motivations that Descartes had for thinking that the pineal gland played this role was because, well, there was sort of like one of them, because most of their brain is a left half and the right half, and so like right. There's symmetry there. And if for this to be the sort of mediating point, it has to sort of, the information or processing has to come together into one point and then go on to the soul, so to speak. But like, why think that? Why couldn't the mediation be between a sort of complex part of the brain? You know what I mean? Like,
that's how later Cartesians thought of it as well. But for Descartes, because the soul is a simple substance, being immaterial, it's not divisible. You want to see, is there some central indivisible, or not literally indivisible, but some central unified point where all of the information comes together? And the way in which he investigated the structure of the brain, the pineal gland seemed to be ideally located in its position relative to the nerve endings coming into the brain to channel the animal spirits in the way in which it's supposed to. But the animal spirits, you can't see them, and so this is not really a testable hypothesis. So Descartes' reasoning for it had to be purely a priori, although supplemented by these remarks about where the gland is located and its structure. And his critics said, no, this gland does not have the mobility that you think it has, and so can't really have that flexible role that it's supposed to play in moving muscles and responding to sensory input.
Yeah, and then one other thing before a closing question. Another place where Laforge sort of goes beyond what Descartes wrote was regarding the immortality of the soul, because as I understand it, Descartes, well, he took himself as having proved that in principle, like the mind can come apart from the soul, but he did not show, and perhaps didn't think that he could show, at least from sort of a priori argument or something like that, that the soul was immortal. Whereas Laforge thought he could give some argument or that in a Cartesian way to that effect. So, I mean, I do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, Descartes thought that he could show that the soul was naturally immortal in the sense that, not being material, it was not subject to decay. The first edition of the Meditations has a subtitle in which the immortality of the soul is proved. In the second edition, that line is no longer there. And I think what he took himself to have done is laid the foundations, the metaphysical foundations, for the natural immortality of the soul, by showing that the soul is distinct from the body and thus not subject to the kind of disintegration that the bodies are subject to. Naturally, the soul will not die when the body dies. But to prove that the soul is immortal, you'd have to do more than that. You'd have to show that either the soul does not have built into it some kind of self-destruct mechanism, or that God is committed to never destroying a soul. And Descartes thought that these were theological issues, or only issues that could be resolved by revelation. Here's an instance where Laforge thought, no, well, Descartes, you could go further than that. It does require taking some theological premises into account, but Laforge thought you could actually prove not just that the soul is immortal by its own nature, but that it is immortal, will survive the death of the body.
Yeah, and he said some things about God being immutable, and so he wouldn't change his mind about these sorts of things.
Having created a soul, God would not go back on that act and thus destroy it. But again, he takes himself to be not saying anything that he didn't think Descartes would say or could have said.
Right, and that in that sense, he is a good Cartesian.
A good Cartesian.
All right, kind of. All right, so yeah, I do normally end these interviews with a sort of general kind of metaphilosophical question about the value of philosophy. But maybe I'll just ask more specifically, like, what do you think is the value of like this kind of historical philosophy? Why is it worth doing? Like, why do you enjoy doing it? And what's the good that comes out of it? What do you say?
Well, I enjoy doing it because it's really, to me, fascinating to immerse yourself in another period with other personalities and the challenges they face and their personal relations with each other. But the value of it is, I'd say, the same as the value of philosophy. It teaches us, it exposes us to other ways of thinking, but it also trains us to be good thinkers. That is, thinkers who develop skills in assessing arguments, in becoming rational in our beliefs, tailoring our beliefs to evidence, and abandoning beliefs when the evidence is contrary to them. This is what philosophy is about being a good thinker. And doing a history of philosophy introduces us to some of the best thinkers that have ever existed. And in this day and age, when there's a lot of bad thinking going on, conspiracy theories, people believing the craziest things and refusing to abandon their beliefs in the face of evidence that they are absolutely false and unsubstantiated, I really think we're in dire need of more philosophy Otherwise, we're going to continue to elect people who not only are not qualified for political office, but have no conception of our most fundamental values like democracy, justice, equality, fairness, and so on.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from there. So yeah, so thanks so much for taking part in this, Professor Nadler. It's been really great having you and having a chance to look at this book. I forget if you mentioned when this is expected to be available, but
I think it should be out within the next month or so.
Okay, so yeah, perfect. I'll include some links to where that can be found in the video description. And yeah, thanks so much for doing this.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.